You guys maybe just caught a bit of the discussion I just had with some folks about the Solana network and ecosystem. We'll kind of follow probably a very similar format and just have a very similar discussion. And of course, you guys are going to bring different perspectives as well that we'll all want to hear. So, really, very quickly. May have already heard this, but we'll just go through some quick intros. I'm a research analyst with Messari that works on what we call protocol coverage and protocol reporting and producing quarterly reports for base layers in my particular case. And Avalanche is one of those networks that we also track the progress of the network and the ecosystem. And I've had a chance to catch up with a bunch of people from the Avalabs team. And that's who we have as well, though now this is our first time meeting, and this was very organic discussion that we're about to have. But yeah, just take us through, who you guys are, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, hey everybody. On my side, my name is Kurahashi-Sofue. I'm the VP of Marketing at Avalabs. I've been part of the company since we came out of stealth about 2.5 years ago. So I've been leading marketing efforts since then. Prior to Avalabs, ran my own agency in 2015 for go-to-market strategy in crypto. It wasn't even called Web3 at the time. Did that for about a few years, and then led marketing for Fluidity. We focused on two things. One was a decentralized exchange called AirSwap, and then the other side was Factora as a security tokens function focused on real estate. And we got actually acquired by consensus right before I started at Avalabs, so great to be here.
I'm Kevin. I co-founded Avalabs. I've been there for a long time, and it's great to be here. I have a technical background, but a lot of business stuff these days, and just came from our office is like 10 minutes away, so it was nice to stop by here. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for coming. We're glad you're here, and we know that Avalanche is a huge ecosystem, and so we have 30 minutes to discuss, which the clock needs to start, my friends, so we don't go way over, because we easily very could do so. So different perspective here, though. Last panel that was up here, we had an investment mind, right, an investor with, I think, some technical expertise, and as well as somebody who's building an application. And my question to them was, why Solana? Right? So here's your chance to let us all to know from your perspective, why Avalanche?
Do you want to take that from the
why
technical
build with
perspective?
Avalanche? We can say that more specifically.
Yeah. I mean, so it's a very big question. Asking that question for something like an ecosystem. I mean, I get asking that question for something like a very specific niche product. Asking that question for an ecosystem is a very complex one. It comes down to an answer of like a lot of different things, from tooling to what the engineering roadmap. We're a tech company. We on the Avalabs side, we have extremely strong and committed tech vision over the next couple of years. We haven't been particularly open about it, but there's just so much developing over the next couple of years, and there's just so much to be said from the technical side. But then it just barely scratching the surface over just what the ecosystem looks like, what the tooling looks like, what differentiates us from a offering perspective for developers. From the subnet architecture to just like the way that we bind all the tooling together, and basically we view ourselves as if you want extremely fast, robust, and reliable technology that is given to you as an entire package from the blockchain layer all the way to the wallet layer, which we're building wallets and we're going to open source everything, then that's one of the big reasons to go with Avalanche. It's by far one of the best development. One of the best ecosystems to develop in. It's incredibly backwards compatible. It's incredibly flexible, and the vision of effectively elastic blockchains on the go, which is what we're pioneering with subnets. Mm-hmm. That speaks to a lot of what people want in this space, which is sovereign chains, because they want to be able to control their own economies, their own communities, and so there's just. I can talk on for hours for this thing. So it's a very complex question to answer.
Yeah, it's a loaded one for sure.
It's a loaded one for sure. Yeah.
I think from maybe more on the marketing perspective, building off of a little bit of what Kevin says, subnets is an amazing product for a lot of different customer personas. So the way we see it at Avalabs is we're splitting our verticals up, and it's basically our kind of road towards attacking the ecosystem that isn't necessarily an Avalanche, or growing the ones that are consistently or are currently building on top of it as well. And the verticals are as such. We have NFTs, you have institutions and enterprises, DeFi, gaming, and then you kind of have this one vertical which is a little bit different from the rest, which is also, of course, developers. The reason why I say it's slightly different is kind of persists across the whole stack, but we feel like it's very, very important to, of course, develop or grow that kind of ecosystem, of course, because you kind of have that supply side problem. And when it really comes to beyond the technical advantages of Avalanche, I would really say it's kind of ties to our backgrounds holistically. A lot of the early hires, a lot of the recent hires as well, we all come from pretty deep backgrounds in Web3, and so the expertise is definitely there. And I always say it isn't necessarily that we know exactly what you as a DApp or you as a deployment should be doing, but we definitely know a lot of the things you shouldn't be doing, because we've made those mistakes. We have done it maybe a few times in our career, and we also know, okay, that's what we should be avoiding, that's what DApp should be avoiding. That's probably kind of the one piece that stands out to me from our expertise perspective. The other side of the equation, I would also say the ecosystem, the people that are part of this community, the developers, the users, everyone in between. The way we've kind of cultivated it, it was really about slow, organic growth, focusing on mission-driven growth, not really about growth hacking, not about getting numbers. And so the community really was steadily growing. And now, we had Mainnet anniversary, actually, I don't even know what day today it is, but the 21st. So it's a few days ago. And so the 2 years running, we've already come such a far way. A lot of people are now kind of looking left and right, helping each other out. We want to continue to develop that capability. Community truly exists both digitally and physically. And in order to actually grow that the way we want it to and actually have long-term impact, you have to take really good care of that community and also make sure that they're getting what they need when it comes to support or some sort of infrastructure. So that's kind of the opportunity that we're seeing now. Hopefully in the next 6 to 12 months, we'll have a much more mature capability along those lines.
Well, we'll get to talking about those next 6 months in due time here. But yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, it is a super loaded question. There's a lot to consider. I know there's a ton of moving parts to the Avalanche system, the ecosystem, the network, I mean, everything. So like, there's very different reasons for one person to want to build on Avalanche versus another company or whatever, right? Another solution. Now, we could go in so many different directions. Every time I chat with you guys, I feel like we could just go in a whole bunch of different directions. But one thing that that I think maybe is a little unclear to a lot of folks, as well as the impact on the network, and I'd like to get into that a little bit too, because I have an opinion about how subnets impact the network as a whole. But can we spend a little bit of time actually just kind of diving into like what subnets are for folks that maybe are a little unfamiliar? Like what does a subnet do in general for the primary network as an ecosystem, but also for those that are building on them or utilizing them? So can we just kind of give us the rundown on and I think subnets are a major value proposition of the Avalanche system, as well as a way to scale. So maybe you can dive in a little bit and just kind of clue us in more on like what subnets really are all about. What's the ethos behind a subnet?
Yeah, maybe I can get started. So there's a lot of opinions over what it means to scale, what it means to have applications that run in a way that can handle millions of users. There's there's a part of the crypto space that believes that you got to have these applications in a way that they settle on other chains and so on. That's the L2 thesis. There's a lot. I mean, that's just like one of them. There's many other different ways. Subnets are effectively a very generic construction that has some niceties tied to the Avalanche primary subnet, but for the most part, it's effectively a generic elastic on-the-go blockchain deployment in a way that allows anybody to just literally with a few transactions spin up a new EVM chain, borrowing from the existing validators of Avalanche. And soon we're going to have permissionless subnets, which are going to allow anybody to validate from the primary subnet rather than just whitelisting. And it's a way to effectively go from, okay, I have an application that I want to scale to, let's say, 1 million TPS. I know that the primary subnet, because it's too decentralized, is not going to be able to handle that kind of stuff. I want to be able to control that network of users myself. I want to create my own economy. I'm just going to run a subnet, a few clicks, and you basically get to run your own kind of like not siloed, but almost kind of like siloed from a performance perspective, blockchain that runs the EVM, that uses the validators from the Avalanche network. You don't have to run any infrastructure. You don't actually have to do anything. And in fact, soon you'll also not be able to need to run any of like the explorers or wallets, infrastructure. Everything will be provided for you. It's almost like as if you just write a few lines of code to deploy an ERC20 on Ethereum, but now you run a few lines of code and you deploy, and you never have to think about an entire new blockchain. Now, there's a lot of niceties that are in there. The idea of borrowing existing validators that have already staked the Vox, that already have built up reputation is a very powerful idea. And the ability to elastically scale up in that number of validators is another very powerful idea. You don't need to have settlement on another chain if you're just running a very sort of like, not super secure, not, maybe like a couple of JPEGs or something like that network versus, I need to run something else independent of the primary subnet, but it's also very value additive. There's a lot of things in it, and I want it to be very decentralized and very secure and very replicated. Decentralization just really means replicas. Subnets are just generic construction of, okay, you want to go from 0 to 1, subnets for like deploying a blockchain with your own custom virtual machine with borrowing the validator set that exists. It's the fastest and most elegant way by far to go from 0 to 1 in that new economy. So, and I think there's going to be this shift in the next 5 years where you're going to see a proliferation of all these like app chains. And as far as I can tell, subnet design, technologically speaking, and from a tooling perspective as well, is by far the most flexible one out of all the offerings out there. So this is kind of like why we're getting so much demand for it. People are asking for it. And when it comes to like, okay, I need to deploy an app chain, it seems to be like the primary choice. It's not quite there where we would want it to be yet, because permissionless subnets have not launched yet. The tooling isn't quite there yet, but within like say 6 months, it'll be like a whole, like it's basically like 0 to 1 in like a day. You can launch your own blockchain. You don't have to ever think about it.
Right. So awesome. Anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, maybe the angle for subnets too is I can kind of quickly touch on where we're at right now in terms of the ecosystem. So the areas that have really taken a hold of subnets, at least the permission ones, have been gaming and institutions and enterprises. I think the other kind of caveat there is the time to market for both verticals is much longer than perhaps maybe like a dApp within the DeFi ecosystem, or maybe something a little bit more simple in nature. So that's to what Kevin was talking about in terms of customization and just basically siloed performance, where you actually don't have to compete with other dApps or tooling or anything else of that sort with the same resources. And I think that's really important for games. Also, like the example that we typically give is, does it make sense for games to have on-chain transaction fees for every single function that they have within their game, or does it not? Most often, at least the way we're seeing Web 2 games, it seems like the answer is more leaning towards no. And so those are kind of the easy examples, and it can get much more complex, but that's really what we're trying to enable these types of projects and founders.
Awesome. So kind of in summary, the way that I think about it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but subnets is a way to scale in some way or another, but it's also a way for developers to build very quickly, but in a flexible, customizable way that allows for their individual dApp to also scale, right? So it's almost like a multiplying effect between the primary network being able to scale, but also for applications to be able to scale themselves with the flexibility to tap into some level of security that they decided is best for their network. So, right, it doesn't have to utilize the entire validator set. It can choose a specific, it can choose some level of being a public network or a closed private network, right? So like, to me, that's a value proposition that we don't necessarily see with other types of networks. Now, again, we track the progress and health of the Avalanche network over time. You know, pretty similar to many other base layer protocols, experienced a ton of growth through the end of 2021. Still a very good and healthy Q1. Obviously, second quarter things didn't go so well for anybody during that time in terms of some metrics, right? But even user activity and things like that sort of go down. That doesn't mean that building stopped, right? There was actually a lot of successful things that came about in Q2. One of them, the end of Q1 to be more accurate, but we saw DeFi Kingdoms, I think at the very last day of the first quarter, roll out their subnet. But then we saw more in Q2 that included Kurahashi as well. And there was sort of like an outcry. And it's one of my favorite things to kind of chat about. Because obviously a lot of people just look at the value accrual of the network and the value of a Vox, right? And there was so much going on in Q2, it was impossible to do any sort of attribution analysis to say like, oh yeah, things went down because of these subnets launching. Taro had collapsed. Like there was a lot going on. The macro environment was not exciting or very good for any base layer for that matter. But and I know that, like you guys, I'm sure you know similar feeling. Like I don't really focus too much on that value accrual, but I know that it was a topic in the community in Q2. And during that time, because Kurahashi and DeFi Kingdoms rolled out, we saw about 50% of the activity on the primary chain decline, right? In terms of daily transactions, all sorts of things like that, right? And we could say maybe there is some impact to the value accrual of Vox. But my question is, and my thought is, would DeFi Kingdoms have even been there in the first place if it wasn't for the subnet value proposition? Would any chain be on the primary network without the subnet value prop? And so if not, then doesn't it work the other way around? That's where my head goes, is like the value prop was there. They were operating on the primary chain for some period of time, knowing that they were going to utilize a subnet.
That's right.
And second to that is the underlying infrastructure is going to continue to grow as more and more subnets roll out. So isn't that then also a value accrual to kind of think more longer term about? And that's curious, like, I guess here's your response to the community that still has any feelings about subnets rolling out and the value accrual mechanism.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Everything you said is precisely right. I mean, I don't know that the community fully understands this on the Avalanche side. The major set of questions were really more external. People that didn't really understand, they look at the graphs like, what just happened here? You know, this drop in transactions on the C chain. It was a little bit confusing, but it's literally designed this way, right? Like subnets, most abstractly speaking of it, is almost, the way to think of them is almost as like performance isolation per contract, right? Like there was the Kurahashi contract. It was getting a lot of activity, was bogging down this one public good, which is the C chain. And everybody, obviously, it's like limited capacity. It cannot go anywhere because it's been parameterized that way. And now it was taking up so much. Everybody basically got sidestepped because of the Kurahashi activity. And then going to a subnet is like performance isolation for that smart contract specifically. So now that gets moved to the side on its own subnet. And then now it gives up just more space for the C chain to continue doing the same path of new contracts deploying there, finding users on the main chain first. And if they really start getting traction in there and start getting really a lot of growth, then they can move on to their own performance isolated subnet afterwards. Like it's a great model to test out the environment, get immediate exposure to because everybody already supports the C chain, but not everybody already supports subnets, right? So going to a subnet directly might not actually be a good idea for you as a smart contract. You may want to deploy a smart contract test out your users first on the C chain, see and have integrations to everybody, see if you can actually get traction, and then move on to a subnet. This is going to be the cycle continuously. Right. And then subnets oftentimes are also going to probably actually burn a Vox. They don't actually they're not even going to launch their own token. So we're working on some stuff internally right now to precisely launch a few really really exciting subnets that are going to use a Vox as a token, but it doesn't affect the performance of the C chain. So, and then of course there's the final point, which is that while maybe tokens to pay for fees are not a scarce resource within the Avalanche ecosystem, you can have your own native token on like Corbata token to pay gas fees with. The staking of a Vox is very much a scarce resource. Mm-hmm. And staking of a Vox is important and required for everybody because it has very important implications for how we actually account for value transfers between subnets. We're working on a very, very efficient cross-subnet communication, which requires everybody to stake the primary subnet. And that's not a scarce resource. So as if, that is a scarce resource. And as more subnets come along, like you can imagine that, if just 100 subnets come along, you just literally cannot have enough Vox to stake as it currently stands, because there's just too few validators. You actually have to increment the number of validators significantly to accommodate 100 plus subnets. Those guys you cannot use the same number of validators or the same validators for even more than 2 or 3 subnets realistically. You have to continue adding more and more validators to validate all these other subnets. So the way to think of it is not quite linear, but the number of total validators in the Avalanche network somewhat approximates probably like a linear function over how many subnets, and linearly approximate how many validators there are going to be, right? As more validators come along, you're just going to have this increase in number of validators. Maybe it's probably more than linear actually, because there's like a fixed limit per validator. So there's going to be an explosion of validation on Avalanche if we get to the 100, 200 number of subnets, which hopefully we will very soon.
Right, and so essentially what that means is, right now I think there's, roughly 1,500 validators.
Yeah, about right.
Something like
1,400,
that.
Yeah.
So with each subnet, there will be another validator added to the validator set, right? Or
another set of them.
Oh yeah, sure. There's more. I think there's like 3 is the.
No, right now 8 is on DFK or something like that, and then permissionless are coming soon.
Right.
Which we're trying to figure out what the name for them is, because it's not quite permission, but anybody can join at that point. Yeah. Right. So anybody can come in, sees a subnet. Oh, that's a subnet doing so and so. It's open and it's providing rewards in some particular token. I'm going to go immediately and become a validator on Avalanche, and then I do both validation for Avalanche and validation for that subnet.
Right.
And so realistically, every single machine can probably run like 3 subnets, unless you go to like a massive machine. But realistically, 3 subnets at best.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine that like 100 subnets now starts really adding up the number of validators really quickly.
For sure. So again, it's a really interesting topic, right? What's valuable? What's more valuable? 500,000 transactions on the C chain, or thousands or even hundreds of thousands of validators running a network that fuels all of these subnets that are choosing their level of security, right? So like, it's a very interesting value prop. I think it's, it'll take some time, but I just like to think about, make sure like, hey guys, the value accrual may not look the way that you think it should right now, but the idea is to grow the infrastructure of the network, which also is valuable.
Yeah, so. I totally get why people get confused over it, because they're used to the model where everything sits on one chain, right? And now that's a one scarce resource, and it's a very easy mental model to think of. But that's not how you build good scalable things that are parallelizable, right? Just not how it works, right? The internet was not built by having every piece of information go through one router. You have to distribute that across many. And that's how Avalanche works. But that's hard to think through, right? Like, what does it mean because I don't have one resource that I can now think about the scarcity of that resource and how it accumulates value there. I have to think about it more holistically. So I totally get the complexity of thinking through this, but it should become apparent that validators can only run a limited number of subnets. And if there is going to be hundreds of subnets, why? Because we literally are working towards doing nothing but making a subnet the single best blockchain deployment that you can choose.
Right.
And if you're if the thesis that is going to be that there's just going to be more and more chains doing more and more application-specific things in the future, then subnets are the #1 choice for all of them. And so that thesis should work out easily.
Well, we'll be tracking it, and I'm looking forward to seeing. I want to see that validated number just get to a point where it's like, wow, this is getting to a larger number than we've seen,
That's
right?
Right. That's honestly my only metric that I see. It's like that deployment, and there's like maybe like 100 something on Fuji right now that have been testing out, that have been deployed. You can, which is on testnet. Some have publicly announced releases this fall alone. I can't talk about the unannounced ones. I'll get in trouble, but yeah, there's just a lot of subnets coming.
Awesome. Well, Jay, I want to finish with you. We've talked a lot about subnets. I think wanting to make it clear to the group and folks that are maybe tuning into the live stream, to clear that up, right? Let's talk about these subnets. But obviously, there's a lot more going on than subnet deployments. I know the team has been working hard on improving user experience, tooling, infrastructure, bridges, wallets, you name it, right? Trying to make it as easy as possible for people to use the network in every way that you can. So just know we're looking at that as well, but it might feed into what you're excited about, especially in the next 6 months. So Jay, you mentioned some things that you're looking at. When we think about the next 6 months, what are you most excited about? Like, what's keeping you up at night or helping you sleep best at night? I guess at this point, when you think about the next 6 months.
Yeah, so I think one thing that has to be said, which is clear, is we don't have the privilege of having Kevin explain everything that he just explained about subnets for every single person in the world. So kind of tying into what you were saying with the Corbata and DFK narratives and how that kind of lagged a little bit. There's a little bit of latency and understanding like, hey, is this actually good for Avalanche or is it not? I actually think that was directly attributed to UX. And I can explain that in 2 ways. One of them is from the product side. When you actually have wallets, you have explorers, and you don't have the integrations for all the subnets, all of a sudden like a good example, there was a pro analytics platform, I won't name them, I use them a lot actually, so really good product, but they didn't have the capability to measure all of the subnet activity. And so all people saw, I think this was like maybe 6 months ago, 4 to 6 months ago, was the C-chain activity go down. And that's what started to perpetuate the narrative. Then I think people such as Kevin, myself, a few others, we were all talking about it and really trying to explain as that those types of integrations had to catch up. And it's a little bit out of our control. And so I think we're trying to have better ways to make sure that the UX from the integration side, the development side, is as easy as possible for our protocol and the products that we have underneath it. And so I really do think the 6 to 12 months, I tend to say is kind of the boring stuff, at least in the crypto context. But I think that's the stuff that's really going to unlock amazing things after it's all released. And so UX is one of them. And then I think I also would say, comparatively to like the analytics platforms, you have wallets is a great example. And so Core is a wallet that Avalabs we've been building for quite some time now. We just released a browser extension. The reason why we did that was because we looked left and right and we saw that the ecosystem, at least as it pertains to Avalanche users, wasn't really that mature. And so for users to come in and have to use a custom RPC, basically use MetaMask or any other kind of service that you basically have to rig towards the Avalanche context, but wasn't built for that context. The best analogy I tend to use for that experience is it's kind of like driving in America, but using a car that was built for somewhere else, right? You could probably do it. Some people could probably figure it out, but the whole experience end to end is quite abysmal, I would say, just because you're totally thrown off at what's happening, and that's really why we release Core. And so once it's out in the market, we're really trying to test and iterate as quickly as possible, understand the use cases. Also, the protocol that we've created is highly performant, but also fairly complex. And so we want to simplify that as best as possible. A lot of the stuff that Kevin was talking about when it comes to subnets is also something that we're really aiming to do. And so all the tooling that sits on top should be able to integrate that and make it a little bit easier. Maybe not, I kind of heard the tail end of the previous talk, maybe not at the level of which we want, where it's kind of the scenario where everyone talks about like, we want to make it easy to use so our parents can use it, our grandparents can use it. I actually don't think that's the case just yet. It's probably more like the people in this room. If everyone in this room could use our tooling without reaching out to our help desk, that's an immediate win. And then as we continue to iterate, I think we can aspire to perhaps bring in those people above that I was referencing. But until then, we really need to continue hitting the niche really as hard as possible, so then we can actually continue to double down and hopefully find exponential growth that we found in the DeFi ecosystem last year and the year before as well.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, we'll be continuing to track as we have been, and we're just very curious and always wanting to follow. Real quick, you guys put on some cool events pretty regularly, and every time I chat with anybody in the Avalanche ecosystem, I always ask, what's next? What event is next? The last one, anyway, what's the next event?
Yeah,
and when is it?
So we have 2 events. They haven't been announced yet, but I can give a hint on one of them. One of them's in DevCon Bogota, so if you guys are in the area for that, let one of us know in the community channels. We're happy to throw you an invite. The other one is really focused on developers, a long-standing dev series that we're really excited about. It's about high touch points, engaging developers that we feel like we kind of know from a high level, especially from afar, but maybe not at a local, intimate level. And so you're going to see that somewhere in the United States, West Coast. The announcement actually should be coming soon, probably next week for both of these events. So stay tuned for that.
Will do. Well, thanks again for joining, guys. Good to meet you, and good luck.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right, take care.